You've got Robert Frost, right? The classic, disciplined poet of old school tradition. And then you have Bob Dylan, the rebellious, raw voice of a whole generation. On the surface, they're worlds apart, separated by style, genre, decades, but they are connected by this really surprising artistic thread. So yeah, let's dive right into this.
And look, that's a totally fair question. I mean, one guy was the master of the printed page, the other a master of the stage. But as we're about to see, the way they approached language, truth, and just the human condition, it's way more aligned than you might think.
At first glance, yeah, they seem like total opposites. You've got Frost, who really represents that established, buttoned-up world of early 20th century poetry, and then, bam, Dylan just explodes onto the scene and becomes this defining figure of the 1960s counterculture.
Okay, so to really get what connects them, we've got to start with what separates them. And that's this great divide in how they thought about art itself. And you can see their core differences laid out right here. So Frost, on one side, he was a champion of formal structure. Meter, rhyme, all of it. Those were his tools for creating order. Dylan, totally different. He was pulling from these free-flowing traditions of folk and blues, where the performance and the way you breathe actually shapes the music. And that exact same contrast, it applied to how they talked about what was going on in the world.
And this quote just brilliantly sums up Frost's entire mindset. For him, the rules, the structure, that net, they weren't limitations at all. They were the entire point of the game. That's what created the tension and the power that made poetry work.
And then you get Dylan. There's absolutely zero subtlety here. This isn't a poem to be quietly interpreted. It's a direct, urgent, ethical question aimed right at the heart of society. He's not just observing things, he is demanding an answer about war and violence.
So really, it all comes down to this. Frost gives you a scene and then lets you do the work of questioning tradition. Dylan, on the other hand, stands up and confronts the status quo head-on, turning his songs into these massive anthems for change.
But okay, here's where it gets really fascinating. Because despite all these huge differences, they were both working with the exact same raw material. The way real, ordinary people talk.
This is it. This is their secret connection. Both of these artists knew, deep down, that the biggest, most profound truths could be found and expressed in simple, everyday language. They didn't need fancy academic words. They used the real speech of real people to explore these incredibly deep ideas.
And Frost actually had a name for this, the sound of sense. It's this idea that the emotion behind our speech, its tone, its rhythm, carries meaning all by itself. Imagine hearing a conversation through a wall. You can't make out the actual words, but you know instantly if it's an argument or a quiet confession. That is the sound of sense. And for Frost, that's where all the magic of poetry lived.
This is the perfect example. Listen to that first line, "and miles to go before I sleep." It's practical, right? It's just a statement of fact from a tired traveler. But then he says it again, and the second time, the whole tone changes. It becomes this heavy sigh, filled with the weight of life's endless obligations. The exact same words, but a totally different sound of sense and a completely new, profound meaning.
And here's the fork in the road. They both used that same tool, but they pointed it in opposite directions. Frost turned that authentic human sound inward to explore the deep psychological world of a single person. Dylan grabbed that same idea, but he cranked the amplifier to 11 and pointed it outward, turning it into a communal chant for an entire generation.
Their use of symbolism followed the exact same pattern. Both used simple images to talk about big ideas. But Frost, he drew from the quiet, natural world around him, roads, walls, woods, to explore these personal, philosophical questions. Dylan's symbols were bigger, grander. He was mixing myth and history to make these huge comments on society itself.
So what does this all add up to? Well, it means they weren't opposites after all. They were two artists telling the same human story, just from two different but equally important points of view.
It really is all about focus. They both tackled the big, universal themes, but they did it from different angles. Frost, he zoomed way in on the individual's quiet struggles, with choice, with duty, with feeling alone. Dylan zoomed way out, focusing on our collective fight for justice, freedom, and trying to belong.
When you read a Frost poem, it feels like you're pausing at a crossroads in the woods. It's this simple, straightforward moment that somehow leads to a deep internal realization. The whole journey is inward, right into the mind of the person speaking. But Dylan's songs, they're like jump cuts in a movie. I mean, think about All Along the Watchtower. It just drops you into the middle of a conversation, presents this vague threat, and then nothing. No resolution. The whole story is symbolic. It's an open-ended allegory about power and change.
So what we have are the two great journeys of modern life, really. Frost gives us that inward journey, the lonely, solitary search for meaning inside ourselves, and Dylan gives us the outward journey, that powerful call to find our place in the world through community, through action, through song.
In the end, they're really just two sides of the same artistic coin. And seeing that, it reveals something so vital about the American voice. One whispers and one shouts, but they both show us that our greatest art comes from making the language of ordinary people sound absolutely extraordinary. They're not opposites at all. They're two essential parts of the very same story.
And that leaves us with a pretty big question, doesn't it? In our world, right now, today, whose voice do we hear more clearly? Is it the one that pulls us inward, asking us to reflect on our own path? Or is it the one that calls us outward, to try and change the world together?